We are well into autumn, and that means here in Humboldt County, a lot of our local farms are beginning to harvest some of their colder weather crops. One of those crops that we receive a lot of at Food for People at this time of year is winter squash. Now that could be anything from a kabocha squash to a sugar pie pumpkin, a spaghetti squash, a butternut or honey nut squash, and delicata squash. Now, although a lot of these squashes look quite different, they cook up quite similarly. So in today's recipe video, I'm going to show you how to prepare these in multiple different ways. We're going to go over a few different preparations on how to cook them on the stovetop, in the oven, and even in a rice cooker. So whatever you do, don't be intimidated by this hearty vegetable. I'll show you just how simple it can be. Let's begin with the oven method. For this method, I'll be demonstrating how to roast a whole pumpkin and also how to roast sliced delicata. Start off by washing off any excess dirt, and then line a baking sheet with parchment paper or foil. Then use a fork to prick holes around the top and the bottom of the pumpkin. This way, the pumpkin can release steam during the cooking process. If you prefer, you could use a sharp knife instead. Use whichever tool you feel most comfortable with. They will both be just as effective. Now that the pumpkin is prepared, we can set the oven to 420 degrees and place it in the lower third section of the oven. And onto our delicata squash, which we will bake simultaneously. To prepare, carefully cut into 1/4-inch slices. Some folks peel their delicata squash and remove the seeds, but I love this method because it uses the entire squash and it's so easy. The skin becomes tender with the flesh and the seeds become beautifully toasted and crunchy. It's so fun to eat. Now it's really important to arrange these squash slices on a baking sheet in a single layer so that they cook evenly and become nice and caramelized. When roasting any vegetable, you don't want to overcrowd the tray, otherwise the veggies will steam and get soft rather than becoming crispy. Drizzle the squash with olive oil, ghee, or any neutral vegetable oil, and then sprinkle evenly with sea salt and any other seasonings you like. Place this tray into the upper third of the oven, and then check on them after about 30 minutes. You can see some of these look more crispy than others, so what I did is I removed the pieces that are nice and golden brown, and then I continued to bake the rest for about 5 extra minutes. Just be sure to watch them closely, because at this point they'll cook pretty quick. These squash slices are great as a side dish or as a sweet and salty topping on top of a fresh salad. This is my absolute favorite way to eat winter squash. After about 1 hour, the sugar pie pumpkin is done. I can tell it's done cooking because the skin is dry and crispy and a knife slips right through the flesh. You can see that there's space between the flesh and the skin, which makes it really easy to peel that skin back, which you can later discard. Once the pumpkin has cooled off enough to handle safely, you can cut through the flesh and expose the seeds in the middle. Scoop them out and discard or roast later for a crunchy snack. You can mash the pumpkin with a fork or use a food processor, and now you have homemade pumpkin puree. Use this for baking, soups, sweetbreads, or you can freeze it for later. Now for the stovetop method. To demonstrate the stovetop method, I'm using 2 very different squash varieties, a spaghetti squash on the left and a kabocha squash on the right. We're going to use the same technique of pricking the squash with a fork or a knife so steam can move through the squash and cook everything evenly. Add 2 or 3 cups of water into a large pot and add in the whole squash. You can see the squashes I'm using are a bit larger than the pot, so the lid is not totally secured, but that's fine. We're still going to use the lid so it traps in some of that steam into the pot, which will also help things cook more evenly. Turn the burner on high and bring the water to a boil. After about 25 minutes, rotate the squash and add more water as needed. Most importantly, make sure the pot never dries out. As you can see, mine almost turned into a charred mess. We don't want that happening. When the squash is tender enough to slip a knife easily through it, you'll know it's ready. Remove the pot from the stove and allow the squash to cool before handling. Cut into each squash, slicing it in half, and scoop out the seeds. Kabocha seeds are really thick and tough, so I recommend discarding those ones. Spaghetti squash seeds, on the other hand, are much more tender and taste really delicious when roasted. Kabocha seeds are pretty easy to remove. You can see they're just falling right out. Getting to the spaghetti squash seeds can be a little bit more tricky, but I find it easier when using a pair of kitchen scissors. I use the kitchen scissors to break up the stringy flesh around the center of the squash. This helps loosen the seeds from the flesh so you don't end up scooping out more squash than you do seeds. These are both delicious, served simply with just some butter and salt. Kabocha squash is also delicious in stew, and spaghetti squash pairs really well with tomato sauce or pesto. And last but certainly not least is the rice cooker method. Believe it or not, you can cook a lot more than just rice in a rice cooker. For this method, I chose a small honey nut squash that would fit into the pot with the lid on. Start by cutting the squash in half and scraping out any seeds that you see. Drizzle some oil in the bottom of the pot, which will help the squash caramelize rather than stick and burn. Arrange the squash cut side down and add in about half a cup of water into the pot. Cover and set to cook. Continue cooking until the water evaporates and the setting flicks to warm. The squash should be tender and caramelized at the bottom, but if it needs to cook any longer, simply add more water and flick the setting back to cook. Allow the squash to cool before removing it from the pan, which will help keep that caramelized part intact. Enjoy this sweet squash with a sprinkle of sea salt and butter, or incorporate it into salads, sweetbreads, soups, or rice dishes. These are just a few simple ideas on how to cook winter squash this season. You can use CalFresh to purchase any of these squash varieties, and I also invite you to come visit us at your nearest mobile produce pantry to see what other winter vegetables we're distributing. Happy fall and happy cooking!